Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is On Dog Terms. I'm your host, MJ. I'm here with my co host, Sam. And today we are going to be talking your ear off about what is going to sound super boring. It's called the four quadrants of operant conditioning. But basically, we're going to be talking about how dogs learn or how you can teach a dog something. First, I want to start this episode with a little disclaimer that Sam and I are going to be talking about the scientific definitions of the four quadrants of operant conditioning. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to use all four with every dog. There are some trainers that may not use all four, they may use one or two. There's a whole spectrum of dog trainers and methods out there, but we are just going to scientifically be talking about what the four quadrants are because we think it's super important for you as a pet owner to understand them. If you're going to be training your dog, you have to know what they are and how they work, even if you're not going to use all four of them. I also want to put a little disclaimer out there, or I should say, we want to talk about the stigma around the word punishment because one of these four quadrants, or two of them actually, include punishment. But when we talk about punishment here in this episode, we're talking about it from a scientific definition standpoint. So, punishment is just something that is going to get rid of a behavior. We don't mean anything big or scary or abusive or super physical with our dogs. We just want to make sure that we're all using these scientifically and we're going to teach you what those are and what they mean. But I want to make sure that we put that out there. We're going to start by talking about what operant conditioning is. I've written down a little definition from the internet, so y'all know I'm telling you the truth. So, what is operant conditioning? It is a type of learning in which an animal learns or is conditioned from its behaviors as it acts on the environment. In operant conditioning, the likelihood of a behavior is increased or decreased by the consequences that follow. So, operant conditioning is basically just how a dog learns via consequences. Consequences can be rewards or punishments. Consequences isn't a bad word. For example, if I ask a dog to sit, they sit and I give them a cookie. The consequence of them sitting is that they get a food reward. Sam, why is it important for dog owners to understand the four quadrants of operant conditioning, even if they're not going to be a dog trainer themselves?
I think it's less important for I think the quadrants and the scientific terms are really cool for the people who really like to diagnose the behavior and understand it a little bit thoroughly. But for the average dog owner, sometimes I don't even think it's necessary that they understand what positive punishment or negative punishment or whatever those terms are and how it relates to the quadrants. I think it's just important for people to know how to motivate your dog to do something and motivate them to not do something. Like,
Mhm.
however we slice it, whether we are adding something to increase a behavior or adding something to decrease a behavior, or whether we are removing something to increase or removing something to decrease. In the grand scheme, that's a quick synopsis of how to explain it, but we're going to go way more into it. But I just think it's important for you guys as pet owners when we are trying to manipulate behavior with our animals, with our pets, with our dogs, to how do we do it? What are we doing and why? I don't think anybody needs to necessarily know the definitions, but they need to know how we are influencing our dog's behavior by adding or taking something away.
Yeah, I agree. I like agree, disagree, because I do agree that people don't need to understand the super thorough terminology and all
Right.
that. I do find that when I'm working with clients who have worked with other trainers before and the training just hasn't stuck, they're not ever really taught how to think like a dog trainer in the most basic form. So
Mhm.
they'll think, oh, I'm just going to give the dog food for this, but they're not ever taught to think about all of the other things the dog finds rewarding or the things the dog might be trying to avoid. And those make a big difference. So I think it's important for people to, at a basic level, learn what causes a dog to do something or to not do something so that they can recognize when that's happening in their environment when maybe they don't mean it to.
I love asking my clients and people in general, why does a dog do anything they do? Why does a dog make the decisions they do? And for those of you who are listening and who have never heard this question asked before, take a moment, pause this, and think about that before I spell out the answer. Because we have actually, another thing about it, we have answered this question before. The answer to that might actually not make y'all all that happy because dogs can be quite self-serving creatures and self-serving animals. So sometimes when we're talking about adding reinforcement or even bringing something, using treats or using something to reward our dogs, there's a lot of times that self-reinforcement is just blown over and brushed over and we don't talk about it. But a lot of times the reason dogs keep doing what they're doing is because it feels good and it works to their advantage to keep doing so. So we have to also understand it there's ways that we can build like manufactured reinforcement, treats and praise, and like our reward system and good markers to let our dogs know they're on the right track for those things. But it's easy to disregard how good things feel on their own, just dogs doing dog things, and how you have to be more interesting. Whatever you have to offer has to be more interesting than what feels naturally good to them.
Mhm. And sometimes the environment will train your dog for you when you don't
Totally.
know. So you have to be able to recognize when that's happening, which is why we want to make sure that we teach people what all four quadrants are, even if they don't plan on using them themselves.
Mhm. At least recognize when self reinforcement is happening and how you can either use management or you can use punishment in certain ways to decrease the likelihood for self reinforcing behaviors that feel good to them or maybe are naughty or nuisance to us and we don't appreciate or like. But there's no amount of explaining to our dog that we don't like that. There's no way that
Yeah,
we can verbally in sentences say, hey, I don't like this because of X, Y, and Z. They're not going to get it. So
right.
we have to have different things that relay on their
Yeah.
levels.
So the four quadrants, there are four of them. Just to list them, we have positive reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. And we
Mhm.
want to be super clear that positive and negative do not mean good or bad here. Positive means to add, negative means to subtract. Reinforcement means to build a behavior or create a strong behavior, whereas punishment is going to get rid of a behavior. So if you
Mhm.
use that little formula, positive reinforcement is when we add something to make a behavior more likely to happen. Negative reinforcement is when we take something away to make a behavior more likely to happen.
Yeah.
Positive punishment is we're adding something to make a behavior less likely to happen. And negative punishment is taking something away to make a behavior less likely to happen. And I know that's a lot of words for all the listeners who just listened and they're like, wait a minute, MJ, I didn't have a minute to think about that. So we're going to
Pause
get
it,
in.
go back. Yeah, we're gonna go into into details, but also just go back and re-listen to it because it's in layman's term, very simple terms. That is how it's broken down, and that is as simple as it gets. But it's simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, simple, but it's not easy. Exactly. So let's start with the most popular one, positive reinforcement. So adding something to make a behavior more likely to happen. So when would we use that in dog training?
99.9% of the time, you're going to use some form of positive reinforcement, whether that is treats, it could be praise, it could be toys, it could be a leaf, it could be a tissue, it could be a water bottle. When these are empty, I'll let you know my dogs go crazy when I'm literally finishing it and they're like, give me, I want to play with that. It's really funny. So that there's other ways that you can add or other different terms of positive reinforcement or other like avenues for it. But for the most part, what we in general, what we'll use food, motivation and praise, and then toys.
We're going to use positive reinforcement when we want to build a behavior in a dog, right? So we want to
Yeah.
make a behavior stronger or teach a new behavior, something like that. And Sam and I have done a whole episode on reinforcement in general, where we break
Mhm.
down both positive and negative. So you can, I think it's episode 5, if I remember correctly. So you can always go back to that one and listen to that to get more in detail. But what you can use for reinforcement can be anything that the dog likes. So most commonly, you're going to see food, but it can be toys, affection, play, freedom to run around, freedom to walk out the door, sniffing the grass, anything like that. The key is, though, is that the dog has to actually like it and want it. Because if you're
Mhm.
trying to shove food in their face and they don't want the food or like the food, they're not going to want it. And it's not going to work as a form of reinforcement because the dog's like, I don't even want your hand in my face. So we do have to be aware of that. And this goes for both reinforcement and punishment. And I do have a little note. I want to talk about this when we get into punishment in particular. But we humans don't get to determine what the dog finds reinforcing. The
Ding, ding,
dog
ding.
that. So you have to be able to recognize what your dog finds reinforcing, and then you can use that, but you don't get to go into their brain and program that boiled chicken is their favorite thing in the world.
Right. Even though it might to us seem like high value or something of higher value than a measly treat, it's up to the dog that lets you know what they like and what they don't like. And yeah, like you said, you can't put your emotions or your opinions on that because it's not going to work. You try to motivate someone who doesn't like sweets with sweets, they're not going to be as motivated for whatever it is you have to offer or are asking them. But if someone offered me sweets for something, I'd be a little bit more incentivized. I love sweets. So that's something that I can use as motivation, and I can also use it in other ways, but that's how it would be reinforcing for me, but not the person next to me.
Okay, so that's positive reinforcement. Sam, tell me about negative reinforcement. What is that? What does it mean?
So by definition, that means to remove something to increase the likelihood of behavior or the likelihood or chances the behavior will occur. And something you can remove, there's a lot of different facets for this. You can utilize space. You can remove space as the reward for dogs who are like too close to a trigger or too close to something that makes them uncomfortable or excited. You can remove body pressure, body language and body pressure from you or someone else to reinforce something. You can remove leash pressure to reinforce a certain behavior. You can remove an e-collar stimulation from an e-collar or a vibration, however it's conditioned, but you can remove an annoying or an uncomfortable aversive feeling to reinforce a behavior. And we're going to go into the details of that one too. There's a lot of different ways that removing something actually adds reinforcement to a dog. It's how we're looking at it as well, because you would also be able to follow that up with a positive reinforcement, treat, praise, toy, whatever the case is. But the removal of something is very tactful and it has to be done appropriately and timed correctly too.
Now, is there, and for those of you listening, please keep in mind that Sam and I are just two of many, many trainers out there. And just
Hmm.
because we may talk about how the way we do things doesn't mean it's the only way
Right.
or that there's not a better way. So we're just going to kind of talk about how we use these things. Sam, is there a rule that you have or kind of guidelines you can give on when you opt for negative reinforcement instead of positive reinforcement?
Well, first that comes to mind is if positive reinforcement isn't working. If
Mhm.
I'm sticking my hand in their face to give them boiled chicken or treats or to pet them and tell them good job, and they turn their head, nose, and eyes or the other way, I can't use that to reward them. So sometimes the removal of the annoyance or the feeling is the reward in and of itself. And for some dogs who aren't food motivated, toy motivated, or are a little bit more self-fulfilling, sometimes negative reinforcement would be the first thing I would use. And that way, through repetitions and building that foundation there, positive reinforcement will come. I'm not worried
Yeah.
about that. But it's a matter of building the behavior in that foundation where and when we can based on what the dog's giving us as well.
I'm working with these two mini poodle puppies. They're litter mates. They're really cute. A boy and a girl that I'm working with right now. And I've actually been using a lot of negative reinforcement with them. Honestly, probably a little bit more than positive reinforcement. And I have an example for the male and the female for kind of
Mhm.
what to use it. So the little male mini poodle, he's very confident, very food motivated, but he is what I call a what's in it for me dog. He's like, if the
Mhm.
food is not put as a bribe right in front of my face, if it's not in your hand ready to go, I'm not doing it for you.
Mhm.
And that's partially just that's what he's learned up until this point in his life is he knows he can wait and people will get food out. And he goes, oh, well, now I'll sit or whatever it is that you want me to do. So when I was working with him the other day, I've done enough repetitions of very basic from 1.5 feet away from the dog bed going onto place. Like we're not at sending from a distance or anything like that.
Mhm.
I know that he knows how to do it. But I noticed that he will only do it if I put the food right in front of his face and use it to lead him
Mhm.
on the bed. And I know that we're past that point. I shouldn't have to do that. So what I would do is I would not have food in my hand. I would tell him, place, point to the bed, just like I have all the other hundred of times that I've done this. And when he didn't see food in my hand, he would just look at me. So I'd take the leash and very gently just put a teeny bit of leash pressure in the direction of the bed, not enough to
Mhm.
drag him. And I mean, he's a mini poodle puppy. He's a small dog. If I wanted to, I could. Not enough to move his body, just enough to have that tension in the direction of the bed. First time he kind of like put on the brakes and he's like, "What are you doing?" And then after a second, he gave into that pressure, stepped on the bed. I released the leash pressure. Then I also produced the positive reinforcement. So I was using
Mhm.
both, but negative reinforcement came first. It took maybe 5 repetitions of that. And then I said, place, I pointed to the bed, and he goes, okay, cool, got it. Because I can avoid that sensation of the pulling on the leash if I just get on the bed and then positive reinforcement comes back into play. So
Yep.
it can be something like that. For the female dog, they both were really struggling with stairs, like, they just would not do the stairs at all. She's also not very food motivated, so when she's presented with this giant staircase in front of her, and piece of food that she doesn't particularly care about, she's like, I'm not going up those stairs. So it's kind of the same thing, a teeny bit of leash pressure, not enough to lift her, not enough to drag her. But I would sit maybe 3 or 4 steps up and apply a teeny bit of leash pressure in my direction. And as soon as she took 1 foot and put it on the first stair, I released that leash tension. So I'm just
Mhm.
reinforcing her putting 1 paw. And then once that is easy, 2 paws. And then once that is easy, that back foot coming up. And before you know it,
Mhm.
she's going up the stairs because I've taken the time to teach her how to use her body. And there's nothing giant and terrifying happening. But it's in order to turn this sensation off, you have to take one step in
Yep.
that direction.
Yep.
So there are definitely times where negative reinforcement is going to be very handy to know how to use fairly and when to
Yeah.
use it. It's usually going to be when positive reinforcement is not working for us for some reason.
Right. It could be that positive reinforcement's not working, or it could just be that you have a what's in it for me dog that has that attitude or mentality of, well, I'm not going to do it unless you make me or unless you enforce it or unless you pretty much put my body there. And sometimes that doesn't mean we have to necessarily increase the amount of pressure or motivation is being used through the leash, but there's always a line of too much for the moment, like too much pressure, too much stress added into that behavior or to that scenario, where a different scenario for a different dog, that level of leash pressure might be equivalent to diffusing them from, say, reacting at another dog. So when we're saying leash pressure, it is very gentle and directional. I like to think of that as if the leash moves in that area, like that direction, that's an arrow. Where they go. Or if it's this way, they go that way. Rather than say like being dragged to something or using a leash to drag them up onto a place or into loading up into a car or something like that, or to stop a dog from reacting at another dog on the street or something. So it is always going to be dependent on the dog, and they do determine that as well, how much is fair and how much they are willing to work for without scarring. And that's something I'm careful to think about, and especially when I'm teaching people how to use a slip lead specifically, because that's usually going to be our first tool that we're going to use, or like a martingale collar or something like that when we're talking about it. But enough to motivate, but not enough to scar is really important when utilizing that. And no one's ever out to use too much force on their dogs, right? Like that's not what we're out here. And I know our pet owners and our clients aren't like that either. But sometimes too little of pressure isn't going to be motivating enough too. So sometimes it is super important to make sure that we're evaluating each situation and how much effort the dog is giving us. And we need to match that as well.
So when we're using something like leash pressure, for example, when Sam and I talk about that, I think of it just like how Sam said, like an arrow, or I'll use the word leash guidance with my clients. I want you to guide your dog in that direction. So the mini poodle on the stairs, it's not like the first time I taught her leash guidance was on the stairs. I taught
Right.
that to her on solid ground where she's comfortable so she knows how it works. Then it's a tool that I can use on the stairs or to get the other
Mhm.
one towards the bed. So it's a skill that we teach, but that's the concept of how it works.
Another term or another way people look at negative reinforcement in the dog world is like escape or avoidance training too. That's not something we're going to get into the nitty gritty of what those two define and what they mean, but when dogs learn what things they can avoid for better consequences or good positive reinforcements that can come their way, you're teaching them to avoid certain things for better outcomes. So, yes, you're teaching them to avoid, but it's not avoid or you get the hammer now and like you're going to get the smackdown and a big punishment's coming your way. It's not like that. You're teaching them sometimes uncomfortable stimulation or annoying stimulation or feeling or sensation they get is worth and motivating enough to avoid for better outcomes of their situations.
The word avoid is a scary word in dog training. Like I
Mhm.
feel like people hear that and they just assume it has to be something super bad. And I know that I've used this example in another episode, but for those listening, think about it like your car. When you get in your car and you don't put your seatbelt on, that annoying beeping happens. It's not scary, it's not painful, but it's super annoying. And I know, at least for myself, I have learned to avoid it and I don't have to deal with the annoying beeping by just putting on my seatbelt. So it's not something scary that Sam's talking about there. It's just something mildly annoying that the dog's like, I'd rather not deal with that.
Yep. Another way I think about it is like being in direct sunlight versus in shade. I have learned from the complexion of my skin that standing in the sun for too long does not feel good. And it immediately makes me feel better when I step in the shade. So, to avoid the annoying consequences of sunburn, XYZ that happens because of the uncomfortable feeling of being in the sun, I have learned avoid the sun by wearing a hat and then going in shade. Like those are things that I can help alleviate how annoying that is. But overall, I avoid that by going in the shade.
Mhm.
So,
And think about it, like, putting your seatbelt on and getting out of the sun so you don't get fried are better for you. They are safe for you. They're gonna keep you in a healthy state. So, a lot of the times when we're using negative reinforcement in dog training, it's to help the dog do something that is better for them in the long run. All right, let's get into the scary ones or the ones that people think are scary. Let's talk about positive punishment. Positive punishment, from a scientific standpoint, the definition is to add something to make a behavior less likely to happen. Do you have examples in the training that you do regularly that you can think of examples of how you would do that?
yeah, ultimately, when we're trying to add something to decrease the frequency or likelihood that that behavior is going to occur again, we don't get to determine what is punishing, the dog does. So, one of my dogs loves when I spray her with the water bottle, like a squirt gun, squirt bottle, whatever. The other three are very offended when I use it, or even if it's like just visiting in the same space. Sometimes they're like, "It's that freaking thing. I don't like that thing." Even they don't avoid it and they're not scared of it, but they have been squirted with a squirt bottle. So to one, I can't use it as a punishment. That's rewarding. She loves to be crazy and bite it. The other three will go into another room because they will avoid that. So I've used that to say, establish a boundary in the house. They cross the boundary, they get a consequence. And that is the thing that they are learning to avoid because that is the law. When you cross this line, this is what happens. I don't always have it on me. So I have to be able to follow through with other things. But that is an example of how a small term and of an example of positive punishment as well. I'm
Yeah.
applying the water or I'm adding the water to decrease the behavior of them crossing the line and going into my kitchen.
Everybody listening, I want you to stop what you're doing and listen very carefully and rewind this and re listen to it if you need to, because this is the concept or this is the thing that when I fully understood it, it changed everything that I know about dog training and I became a
Mhm.
significantly better dog trainer. So there is a very fine line between negative reinforcement and positive punishment. And I think most people get it wrong. So I'm going to give you an example of a prong collar and I'm going to go back to that water bottle example. So let's remember that reinforcement, we're trying to build a behavior. Punishment, we're trying to get rid of a behavior. But if you are not being very, very aware of how your dog is responding to things, you could be accidentally reinforcing a different behavior instead of truly getting rid of the behavior that you want.
Mhm.
Let's pretend, or let's, hypothetically speaking, say somebody's out walking their dog and their dog tends to be reactive towards other dogs. Maybe they've got it on a prong collar or a choke chain or just a regular, it could even just be a regular flat buckle collar, and they're applying collar corrections or the leash pops with whatever tool it is they have. A lot of people will think that is a punishment. The dog reacts, so they do a leash pop. But if you watch very carefully, let's say the dog sees the dog, starts to get, goes up that ladder, they're starting to get hyped, they lunge forward or they bark. The human adds leash pop, leash pop, leash pop. Dog stops and sits. Human stops with the leash pops. People will assume that that is punishment. But the only way to know for sure is to think in the future, did it ever happen again? Most of the time, people
Yes.
are dealing with reactivity long term because in order for it to be punishment, it has to be effective. It has to get rid of the behavior.
And it is almost instantaneous. If it is not instantaneous, you will find that answer with the second repetition, the third repetition, the fourth repetition. And if it continues to show up at that point, you know it didn't work. The behavior has still been reinforced.
Yeah. And I'll give it like 3 or 4. If it doesn't
Yeah,
happen for the 4th or 5th time, it's not punishment because I do think dogs need to experiment. They don't know just because it happened one time, they may go, that was weird and that was a crazy act of magic. I don't know
right.
why it happened. But as the handler, You have to be very clear in showing the dog why it happened, and they have to
Mhm.
understand it and then stop doing it. But for those leash pops, okay, so the human does leash pop, leash pop, leash pop. Dog stops barking, lunging forward. Leash pop stop. What actually just happens is the dog turned off the pressure, made the annoying sensation of the leash pops go away by sitting or by just stepping back and not barking. What happens is we reinforce the stopping of the barking or the sitting, but we never got rid of the lunge forward,
Start.
bark, all that. Now, that just means your dog is going to get really good at stopping barking quicker or at sitting quicker or at looking back at you quicker. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we get rid of the behavior in the first place. Now, there's a spectrum. So there are some dogs where if you were to give a teeny little leash pop with something like a prong collar, they might find that so aversive that it did work as punishment. I will say they're fewer. I don't think most dogs are that way, but there are some very sensitive dogs that one leash pop can be punishment depending on if the dog views it that way. Most dogs, I think, fall into that negative reinforcement category more often with things like leash pops, regardless of tool. But there are other dogs. I'm going to use my German Shepherd here as an example. I had a dog trainer friend back in Colorado. It was not Sam, it was somebody else.
And was like, dang, are we outing me without outing me?
No, somebody else. And she called him a harder daddy dog. And
Oh,
my German Shepherd
yeah. Yes.
genuinely loves leash pops, leash corrections, especially on a prong collar. It amps him up. He
Fuel.
loves conflict. It's fuel.
Mhm.
So if he is having a moment, let's say we go out on a walk and he's reacting to something. If I give him a leash pop, it's like, oh my God, do it again. It's almost reinforcing. And
Sadistic a little.
next time we go on a walk, he's going to see a dog or whatever, and he's going to go, oh, we can have conflict again. We can do the thing again. So,
All I have to do is this thing, and then she does that thing, and oh, that feels really good.
yeah. So for him, crown color corrections are actually positive reinforcement. I would prefer them not be. My life would be a lot
Right.
easier. But that is where he puts them in within these four quadrants. So I will say most dogs, if that is what's happening, we do the observation, dog reacts or dog does whatever it is that we don't like. We start applying a consequence of some kind, leash pop, whatever. Dog offers a different behavior and can get out of that correction. That is negative reinforcement. So, a really easy way to categorize these negative reinforcement is something the dog can get out of, they can turn it off. Punishment, the dog cannot escape it. It is happening no matter what other behavior they offer. So think of it like when I was a little kid, my parents were very different. My mom put me in timeout and I had to go face the corner. I know this was 30 years ago, guys. I know parents don't do this anymore, but I have to go face the corner as a little kid. And she says, you're in timeout for 10 minutes. I knew after 5 minutes, I could be cute and go, I'm sorry, mommy. And she would let me out of timeout. And whatever I did, probably to my sister, that caused me to go to timeout in the first place, I wouldn't stop doing it because I knew that the
Right.
consequence was something I could get out of.
Yep.
My dad, if one, he was just more intimidating. But if he put me in timeout for 10 minutes, it did not matter how cute I was. If I tried to get out of it, I was in it for longer. That's punishment. And I was much more aware of my behaviors around him because I knew if I got put in timeout, that was it. I couldn't avoid it. There's nothing else I could offer to make it stop. So we have to be very aware of which category we're using if we're going to train our dogs because either we're building a behavior or we're getting rid of one. And if you want to get rid of
Mhm.
one, actually make sure you're getting rid of it. So I know for me, when I'm trying to determine, well, what am I doing? Positive punishment isn't my favorite. I don't think it's anybody's favorite. I do think there's a time and a place for it. For me, it usually comes down to is that a dangerous behavior? Because if
Yeah.
it's not a dangerous behavior, whether it's now or in the future, if it's just the dog's pulling on the leash a little bit, but the handler is physically able to handle that and we have the time and everybody's safe, I'm going to opt for reinforcement of some kind to build a different behavior.
Mhm.
The dog is, I like the example of getting into the trash for this. So let's say my dog were to get into the trash today, but I just changed it. It's a brand new empty bag. There's nothing dangerous. Okay, that's fine right now. But if he did it again and there's like a whole carcass of a rotisserie chicken in there, that's really dangerous. So to me, behaviors that could be dangerous, whether it's now or again, I'd want to go to punishment because I would rather a consequence come from me, something I can control where the dog is not in danger, versus a dog eating something that's going to kill them or getting hit by a car because they jumped the fence or biting a child because now we're going to end up dealing with a lawsuit and the dog possibly getting put down. So for me, personally, when I opt for punishment, it's because there is some severe behavior that is dangerous to the dog or someone else, and we need to get rid of that behavior, and building a different one just isn't going to work for right now.
And dogs don't really have that ability to comprehend the dangerous aspects of things they do, or they don't really care because they just know things still feel good when they do it. So the fairest, and this might be, some people might not agree or might find this controversial, but in my opinion, the fairest thing you can do for your dog, for a dog that does not understand the choices they're making are dangerous to themselves or others, the fairest thing you can do is communicate that with punishment as fast as possible to deter it from happening again. And that gives you so much more room and time and ability to facilitate reinforcement into 10 other things that they could do that are going to feel better than that one thing.
Do you
Or-
remember we actually had a dog when we were working at that place together? It was a dog that kept chasing rabbits really bad. And then when they did
Oh, and was
fix it, she
jumping out
jumped
of.
out of the second story balcony to go after a rabbit. Luckily, she was fine. But that is a dog that it was not in the training protocol that that place was using, which is I wouldn't really want that place to be using punishment anyway. But in the right hands with a trainer that would have known what they're doing. Sam and I were baby trainers back then. We were
Mhm,
still learning very much. That now I would have gone straight to punishment because that dog could have died doing that. And I
mhm.
would rather do something that's uncomfortable for me and the dog, but the dog is physically safe
Yeah.
than have a dog continue something like that and get hurt. So definitely safety is usually top of my mind when I'm going to
Yeah.
use positive punishment. I want to go back to the water bottle example because this is another place where negative reinforcement and punishment, there's such a slight difference, but there's a difference. So
Mhm.
when it comes to using something like a squirt bottle with water or pet corrector spray, I think falls into this. I prefer water bottles over pet corrector spray for this. But let's say dog's jumping and people are using the water bottle to try to stop the dog from jumping. And then people get into, well, all I need to do is pick up the water bottle and he won't jump.
Yeah.
That is negative reinforcement because the dog has learned that as long as it's in your hand, they can avoid it by not jumping. But they're still attempting to. They're still following you around jumping when it's not in your hand. Punishment. I did this with a different client the other day. Dog jumps and the squirt bottle was like on the table next to them. So they didn't even have time to reach for it. But they dog jumps, they go to reach for it. He got down and they go, okay. And they go to put it back down. I'm like, no, no. Next time he jumps, I want you to say no. And then I
So
want you to grab the
correction.
squirt bottle and you're going to spray him anyway, even if he's already on the floor, because that is how we punish. Nope. The behavior you did, I'm communicating to you using the word no, which Sam and I are going to talk about that in next episode. We're going to talk about marker words. But this word tells you that is what the consequence is happening for. And then the consequence is going to happen, regardless of whether you've stopped the naughty behavior. Now we have a dog that doesn't jump. All right. So to recap, negative reinforcement, we're taking something away to build a behavior or make a behavior stronger. Positive punishment, we're adding something to make a behavior less likely to happen again. Now let's get on to our fourth quadrant. So negative punishment, taking something
Mhm.
away, make a behavior less likely to happen. Sam, do you have examples?
Yes. This, I would say, a lot of time negative punishment can fall under just like good management routine too, without actually having to punish a behavior. You can use this as a management tactic, jumping on guests when they come in. You can manage this by removing them from the situation altogether, by putting them in an X pen on the other side of the room, or a crate, or up in a bedroom or something like that. You are still not allowing them to rehearse the behavior, so therefore there is no money deposits going into that behavior. Is kind of a way I like to say it. There's nothing fueling it by it not being rehearsed, but we're still not tackling into like not don't do that by using negative punishment.
Yeah. So, like with negative punishment, we actually want to get rid of the behavior. Though, when I'm training a dog, let's say I'm isolating a behavior, and I'm like, okay, that behavior, I want that behavior to happen no more. And if for whatever reason I determine that reinforcement, it's not going to be as easy as just building a different behavior. So I'm like, okay, I need to use punishment. For me, if it's dangerous, that's where I go to positive punishment because I'm like,
Mhm.
that cannot happen again. If
Right.
it's not dangerous, but it's a nuisance behavior, an annoying behavior, and for whatever reason, I want to isolate it and get rid of it instead of building a different one. Because there's plenty of times where I'm just going to build a different behavior. But if, let's say, I want to get rid of it, usually then I'll go to negative punishment. So, like I did this with, I think I've used this example before. I had these little pugs that I was working with that would just jump up on the pet gate when people would walk in the house. They would
Mhm.
find a pet gate down the hall. They'd jump and bark and lose their minds. All right. Sure, I could teach them a place command or to sit or something like that. But in order to do that, I actually have to get to them and then teach them something. Well, I want them
Right.
to just not jump on the people walking in the house. That's step one. So they really wanted to say hi to me. So when I would walk to them, if they jumped or barked, I would just say no and I'd walk away and I'd actually have me and the owner walk out of the house for like 5 minutes.
Mhm.
We did this, I think twice. The third time the dogs didn't jump or bark because it took 2 times for them to go, oh, if I jump or if I bark, that causes them to leave. I don't want them to leave. Therefore, I'm going to stop barking and jumping.
Yep.
So usually it's most of the time it's going to be taking away freedom, space, or affection. So, like another example, I've got 2 dogs, and one of them loves to follow me around like a shadow. It's annoying. I love him, but it's too much. He's always under my freaking feet. So if I were to use removal of my attention or removal of space from me, let's say he did something that I wanted to punish. If I put him in his crate, not because the crate is the punishment. So it doesn't even have to be a crate. Let's say I put him in a bedroom. It's not being put in the bedroom or being put in the crate that's the punishment. It's not being able to follow me and be near me.
Yeah.
That's the punishment. If I do that to him, my guess is it would be 2 minutes, and that would probably be an effective punishment. He'd be like, I'd never do that again. I just want to be near you. My other dog, the harder daddy dog, he loves his crate. He loves his personal space. If he did something and I put him into a bedroom or in his crate, I could leave him there for 3 hours and he'd be like, that was the best 3 hour nap of my life. Thank you so much for giving me some space. That would not be an effective punishment for him. So, especially with negative punishment, it's very, very dependent on what that dog wants and what they don't want, and what can
Mhm.
you take away that would be effective for them.
Yeah. Kind of like a kid who has his iPad and then has board games, and the parent threatens, well, if you don't get better grades in school, I'm going to take away all your board games. And they're like, great, sounds good. I feel like it's not punishment in those
They're
in
dusty. I haven't looked at them in forever. Do it.
exact. Yeah, I forgot which kinds there are even there. So yeah,
Yeah. Oh my goodness. If you took my nephew's iPad away, he would not be
no,
happy.
please
So,
take my computer away. I'm
yeah.
okay, take it.
Yeah. Negative punishment, I think, is much easier to understand and apply than positive punishment, negative reinforcement for sure.
Yes, those two are tricky. They are
Yeah.
very interchangeable, dependent, and it is dependent and subjective to handler and dog, of course, but dog always is going to be the determination for that.
Or to give people another example, it was kind of comical when I did it. It was a couple years ago when Graham was still pretty young. And he used to get crazy excited about his dinner. He's on a raw food diet. He gets so excited for it. So every night when I fed him his dinner, I would ask him to do like basic obedience stuff. Like I just made him do a little bit of work for me so I could put his bowl down. And he started to it was getting sloppy and he'd get too excited and he wasn't focusing. And I remember one night I approached him with his dinner bowl and I asked him to like sit and heel. And instead of heel, he started like making these weird dolphin like noises, like whining at me. I asked him one more time. He didn't do it. I said, no. I walked away with his dinner. I put it on the counter for 20 minutes and I ignored him.
Mhm.
He was still free roam of the house. But just me taking away his opportunity for dinner, he was like, okay, God, what just happened?
Yeah,
20 minutes later, I pick up his bowl. I go back, heel. Oh, he flips into a heel. He's like, no problem. Got it.
yeah.
So something like that. You're just taking away an opportunity for something or affection or freedom or whatever it is. Taking something away.
Access liberties, access to certain areas of the house, or access to certain liberties within the house.
I've got a couple questions for you before we move on to our
Okay.
next episode. Can these quadrants overlap? Is it possible for something to fit into multiple at once?
Idea.
Yeah.
Like interpretation. Yeah. Like what we just talked about with positive punishment and negative reinforcement.
I especially think that when people don't have a plan for how they're using these things, you can do a repetition of something and it falls into one, and then you do a second repetition a teeny bit differently and it falls into another. There's also a lot of ins and outs. Let's say I'm training my shepherd. He loves food. So I'm using food as positive reinforcement, but then another dog gets too close to him. He's uncomfortable. Well, one thing is positive reinforcement, and then the dog getting closer, he might think is punishment. And there's just two things happening at one time. So usually I'm looking at the whole picture of, well, what is everything happening? What is the dog perceiving in their entire environment right now, not just what I'm doing?
There's a lot of nuances to it as well. Because
Yeah.
it's I can always say A plus B equals C, and that's like that's the important part of quad like having scientific definitions and having real tangible words that describe actions and behaviors and describes it thoroughly for everyone to understand the same way. But there's a lot of nuances to it, and we are still dealing with living, breathing, thinking individuals too. So it's while we can always say it should be A plus B equals C, sometimes it's not always going to be like that.
I had a different question, but we already answered it. My question was, can you intend to use one and accidentally use another?
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you're not paying attention to what you're doing.
You can accidentally do that, but and that's not an example of accidental poor timing. Even we sometimes we're trying to yes and mark a specific reward that or a specific moment that a dog does something correct, but right when we register that we want to say yes and we say yes, and then they do something else really stupid, and you're like, damn it, that's not what I wanted to reward. And then now that
Mhm.
yes was paired with that accidental thing, and that's just poor timing. And sometimes all you can do is go, shit. All right, let's
Yeah.
try again and just do it again. And hopefully your timing is better the next time. It can
Yeah.
accidentally happen. And all you can do is just say shit.
Yeah. That sums it up. I mean, Sam and I are professionals and we're not perfect and we make mistakes. And I will, my lag time in my brain in the 0.2 seconds it takes me to blurt out, yes, my dog might have
Yep.
already done something else. And I'm like, well, shit.
Yep. What are you
Keep
gonna
that in
do?
mind for next time. All right, so those are our 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. Again, guys, you don't need to memorize all of those, but we wanna make sure you have a basic understanding of what they are. That also means you don't have to use all 4. You can pick and choose what you're comfortable with, but even if you're only gonna use, like, I know the positive only is a term that people like nowadays. Even if you're gonna be a positive only trainer or just train your dog effectively using positive reinforcement only, I still think you need to understand what the other 3 are so that you can know if you're accidentally slipping into a different quadrant.
And I think a lot of
And
positive only also utilize a lot of negative punishment in management techniques, like I brought up earlier, to avoid the rehearsal of a behavior happening too. So those two are used big time with I think without accidentally people even like realizing it.
I've definitely watched, and I mean, I'm all for positive reinforcement only based training. I think there's a
Yeah,
time for punishment, but I think some of the best trainers out there are, I think most good trainers are mostly positive reinforcement. I
agreed.
think the best ones can use negative reinforcement and negative punishment and even positive punishment sometimes so
Really
subtly
effectively.
that people don't even notice.
Yep.
Um, but I've also seen some inexperienced trainers that, kind of brag that they're positive only and then they don't realize what they're doing and they're making a lot of mistakes and they're actually putting the dog through a lot of stress and aversion without realizing it because they didn't take the time or open their mind enough to learn. So, well, that's out there, but those are what they are. Um, in our next episode, Sam and I are going to talk about markers. So, markers, marker words, whatever you want to call them. And that is how we communicate when these positive reinforcements or when these, positive, negative, whatever, when these 4 quadrants are happening. So, you want to stay
Mhm.
tuned for that episode. Um, my name is MJ Stoltz. This is Sam or Samantha Sneed. I own Cape Canine Academy. Sam owns Canine Insight LLC. You can find us either by the podcast on Dog Terms on Instagram or TikTok. You can find me at MJ underscore the dog trainer on TikTok or Instagram. Sam, where can they find you?
Facebook, same Canine Insight LLC, or my website's also another one, canineinsighttraining.com.
Perfect. And then I
Mhm.
have a PDF of these 4 quadrants if people want something to look at that I will put in the show notes. So that will be there. It's a free download. You can have it. Otherwise, we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.